Let's welcome everybody tonight because we're going to talk about Peter Muhlenberg. Peter Muhlenberg, a lot of people don't know who he is. Say, who's Peter Muhlenberg? You start talking about Rev War heroes and people that are commenting. George Washington comes to mind, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and even out in this area, Peter Muhlenberg was a preacher. He had a Lutheran church down in Woodstock, and he was only in the county down there, roughly 3-4 years. That's all he was down there. And he was only in Virginia for another 7 or 8 years when he fought all the way through the Revolutionary War. But he's kind of one of the unsung heroes because he did fight through the entire war. We're going to tell you a little bit about him tonight. But before we do, I want to get some guys, just give you an idea what it looked like. Chip, why don't you tell them a little bit about your outfit? And there's a reason that I'm doing this.
Well, first of all, I dress as my ancestor might have dressed. He was a captain in the Georgia militia. Probably didn't join the war till late in the Revolutionary War. He and his brothers were farmers, probably down in Georgia, and probably profiting, I hate to say this, off of England. So they were probably Tories in the beginning, I don't know that for a fact, but they were farmers, though, that I do know, down in Georgia, eastern part of Georgia, and the central part. And they typically would have wore, when they did get involved in the war toward the latter part, they would have wore something similar to this, just whatever they had in their household. May not have a tricorn hat like I've got on here. They may have. They were kind of wealthy because my ancestor went on to become a brigadier general in the War of 1812, and so did his brothers. And his one brother went on to become a 2-time governor of Georgia. So that's where my ancestry was, and typically we would have a haversack because we didn't have a whole lot of pockets. I'll tell you a little secret here. I had these pants when I got them. I had them for a year before I knew I even had pockets in them. So I was using this for my pockets, and I still do. But this is basically, they had everything they could carry with them. They just stick it in here. It's like almost like a woman's purse. And sometimes when you go to look for something there, you can't find it, but it's in there. And this is about it. I had these garters. Typically they would wear socks. Somebody's got them on. But they'd use these garters to hold their socks up because the socks are really long. And I like to tell people I put them on because if we're out in the woods with the yellow jackets in the ground, they tend to crawl at your pant legs, and hopefully they won't get any further than that. But
We did have a couple of guys that had that happen last year. Thank you, Chip.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, tell them about your outfit.
Well, I'm more of the poor boy's outfit, the farmer out in the field. So who's dressed up? This is what I think they would what they wore when they had a meeting to go to or Sunday. Put on a clean shirt and their vest. Long pants were usually something on the lower people wore, not the knickers or the. None of us have knickers on today, and they tuck them in just to keep the bugs out, and whatnot, and then moccasins for out in the woods. The hats are folded here, so that's where we would carry our muskets, so the brim wouldn't get in the way of the barrel.
The thing about that he's talking about with the people, the farmers, and that most of them wore a big floppy hat because it protected them from the weather, the sun, and the elements. And it's amazing. I don't know if you've ever been out when you cut your grass or something. You just wear a big brim hat. It also keeps the gnats away a little bit. They don't bother you as much. I don't know why, but it does work. Yeah. So they had that figured out from that there. All right, Alan, why don't you tell them a little bit about the Continental, the regimental uniform?
I'm sort of a vision of the future. And when Muhlenberg first started, this uniform didn't exist. What you see my compatriots wearing now was the wear of the day. This didn't come on for several years later. What I have here is a replica of a 1766-69 caliber Charleville. This is probably, when the French got involved, this is probably what they brought because it was surplus at the time. Also has a bayonet. Of course, it just goes on. See what I'm doing. Roughly like so. I'm not going to clip it on.
Soldiers didn't need to see to put it on.
Cartridge box. Chip explained a haversack. A pick and a wisp to clean the pan on the gun. Overalls, of course, the waistcoat, and I do have a watch taloned on. The tricorn, if I remember correctly, the white trim also came along latter part in the war. It was called a friendship ribbon, and the white was added to represent the friendship with the French when they had entered the war. So, other than that, most of everything I have on. They also carried a canteen that was metal, and it sort of thumps and bings and dangs when you don't have water in it. So I didn't put it on tonight. So other than that,
Maybe a powder horn.
Okay.
if they had a rifle, it was a powder horn, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes they'd have a powder horn, and sometimes they'd have two bags. They'd also have an ammunition bag. It wasn't necessarily one of the cartridge boxes. They'd have a leather bag that they could put their cartridges in and fire. And it just depended on where you came from. Because most of the thing about the uniforms, until they got to the regimentals, the uniform you wore is what basically your wife usually, or one of the people in the family, even maybe yourself, made your own clothes. Now, I'm dressed like this here. This is pretty much what Peter Muhlenberg would have wore. Now, there's the story, yes, that he had his preacher's frock on over the top when he did his last sermon. But when he took it off, and a lot of them like to say, well, he had that colonel's uniform on. Well, he would have actually probably had something like this, but he would have had the gorget up here, which is that brass plate up here that told you that he was a colonel. And he had a sword. And that's one of the ways that you could tell who the officers were, because they had swords. And eventually, when they started wearing these, they would have a sash in there. The color of the sash would tell you what rank they were. But when George Washington first got the war going, he actually wanted more of a hunter's outfit to be the official uniform of the Revolutionary War. It wasn't until a couple years later when they convinced him to go with the regimentals. And that had a lot to do, I think, with the French coming in.
One more thing, he's got the.
This is the Charleville.
This is a short brown vest, a second edition brown vest. The original brown vests were a little bit longer, a lot heavier, so that's why I don't have this longer one. This is a typical gun that the British would have carried. And the only reason I've got it, because I just assumed one thing, I like it. And the other thing is I assume my ancestor, maybe they were profiting off England, they might have had brown vests, that acquired them through, for whatever reason, but more than likely they would have had rifles.
Okay, yeah. Well, a lot of them went to rifles that came out of the hunters and that came because that's what they used the rifles for. They were better weapons out in the field when you were hunting. And most of the ones that the Americans started with were weapons that were made here by different armors and stuff. They would end up picking up the brown vests off the battlefield, and the Charlevilles they'd get when the French joined and then pick them up. Because if somebody died out there and your weapon broke, you'd pick it up. And sometimes people would pick up a second weapon. And I'll give you one more little tidbit about the weaponry before we move on here. The most feared weapon was not one of these. He's got it right on his belt there. The bayonet. That was the most feared weapon in the Revolutionary War. Nobody wanted to have 18 inches of steel run through their body. And when you figured that the average firing time for the musket, which is a faster firing weapon than the rifle, was 20 seconds. They need you to fire 3 times in 1 minute.
Not very accurate.
Now, they're only accurate basically up to 50 to 80 yards. If you're really good at it, you could be 80 yards, but 50 yards. And most people, when they fired, they shot high. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is, when you pull back on the trigger, a lot of people, when they're sitting here and they start to pull out, they have a tendency to lean like this, and then as it starts to kick at them, because that flash fires off first before the ball comes out, which raises the barrel. You really had to learn to concentrate to keep the barrel down, or it would pick it up, so they fire over the top of it. Now, if you think about it, you got a guy that's 50 yards from you, and you fire and you shoot over the top of his head. You got 20 seconds to load that before he gets you with his bayonet. That's why the bayonet was most hit.
The Americans feared the English bayonets.
Exactly, but you know, the Americans turned tight on them, and there are some of them you'll see in here where they went after them with the bayonet. The Americans did. They picked up on that real quick, but of course a lot of the Americans were British trained.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a lot of people says, never bring a knife to a gun battle.
Yeah.
But if you got someone that's proficient with a knife, if he gets within 10 steps of you,
You're in trouble.
he's gonna get you before you get a chance to pull and shoot.
That's right. It's amazing how fast you can move. Even an old guy like me, I can cover 50 yards in less than 20 seconds. I may not like it when I get to the end, but I can do it. Well, guys, let's go ahead and you guys can kind of, we'll get into this going here. We're going to talk about Johann Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He was known as Peter. He was an American clergyman, soldier, and a political figure in the new independent United States. He was born 1 October 1746 in Trapp, Pennsylvania, to Anna Weisser and Henry Muhlenberg, a German Lutheran pastor. As a young man, he enjoyed fishing and hunting more than studying and aspired to join the military. So even back then, he wanted to be in there. In 1763, he was sent with his brothers to Germany. His father wanted them all to study to become ministers. But when he got over there, the teachers in the school said, "This guy's not going to be a minister. He just doesn't have what it takes. We think he ought to go into the merchant business." So he ended up working for a grocer over there for about 6 years, and he's sitting there working, and he says, "You know, this job's not for me." He said, I was here probably a couple weeks, and I learned everything I needed to know about being a merchant, and it's not for me. So what did he do? He joined the British Army. And he joined the 60th Regiment of the British Army there and was in them for a while. And they found out that he could write, so he became an aide to one of the officers, a secretary, if you would. And that officer got reassigned to where? Pennsylvania. So he was brought back to the United States and got into Pennsylvania. And it's when he got in there, oh, let me tell you an interesting thing, what they used to call him when he was with the British Regiment, they called him Devil Pete. Now, I never got the full explanation of why they called him Devil Pete, but I can imagine there, but that's, I'll leave my imagination go. So anyway, he then got an education at Philadelphia, which is now the University of Pennsylvania. And he decided he was going to go into the ministry after all. So he studied to become a Lutheran minister. And lo and behold, he had one of the guys told him, he says, "You know what?" And the guy that told him this is an interesting part of this story here. If you remember, I told you the name of our chapter. The guy that talked him into coming down to Woodstock was James Wood Jr., who is James Wood II, who is who our chapter is named after. So, and anyway, James Wood, for those of you who don't know, was the founder of Winchester. His father was. So anyway, James Wood talks him into coming down to Woodstock. Now, there's a problem there. At that time, you could not come down to the state of Virginia and preach if you weren't
Be an
ordained
Anglican.
by the Anglican Church.
Yes.
Yes, if you weren't ordained by the Anglican Church, you couldn't come and preach in Virginia. So he hot-foots over to England, gets ordained there, comes back, goes down to Woodstock, and he immediately becomes just as popular as can be. And so while he's down there, some of the things he did, he started listening to somebody, Patrick Henry of all people. He decided he liked old Patrick. And Patrick Henry had been listening to those people up in Boston. And they were having all kinds of problems up there because we know that, the British said, we're going to shut down Boston, and they're in a state of rebellion. We're kind of angry at them. Well, down here, Virginia says, you know what? We kind of like what's happening. I mean, we kind of like our guys up in Boston, and we don't like what's happening to them. So we're going to go side with them. We're going to be behind them with everything they're asking for. Now, they didn't want to leave the crown at the time. They still all wanted to be members of the British Empire. But they wanted to have the rights of an Englishman that they weren't having. So what did he do? Well, he joined the Committee of Safety and the Committee of Communication. And I got somebody here that's going to read about that, right? Who's got that?
I do.
Well, then come on up here. Tell them about what these committees are.
We all hear in the news about the CIA and things that are done as gathering information on what the public does. It started many a year ago. And the reason I say that, in the American Revolution, there were committees of correspondence, committees of inspection, also known as committees of observation, and committees of safety, were different local committees of patriots that became a shadow government. So you think of the CIA and some of these alternate groups as something modern, but yet here we see in this period of history, basically that was the original version of the CIA, watching out and keeping an eye on things that were going on with the British. So, as this went on, they took control of the 13 colonies away from the officials, who become increasingly helpless. I guess, in other words, these committees were now calling most of the shots that were going, and what people were doing, and what they were protesting. Of course, we all know what that outcome was. It was the wars. So the committees of safety were emergency panels of leading citizens who passed laws, handed down regulations, enacted statutes, and did fundamental business prior to the Declaration in July 1776. So that all goes back to the shadow government. They were actually, these committees of outstanding citizens were actually running pretty much the business that this country was doing early on, as it says, before the Constitution was passed. And it was also before individual state constitutions, because if you remember back, there was no individual state constitutions, let alone a constitution that grouped the original colonies together as one. The committees of correspondence also functioned mainly as means of spreading news. You figure there was no Facebook, there was no Fox News or CNN, or you couldn't turn on the TV or the radio. So things that were happening just probably within a few miles, unless you were out where someone happened to pass by, you didn't know what was going on. So these committees helped make sure that you knew the events that were going on, and the way some of these events and some of these taxes and laws that were trying to be enforced were affecting you. So they also spread information of the Patriot cause and mobilized opposition to the British policies in cities and towns and royal committees throughout the colonies. In other words, they were what they called in World War II, the guerrilla fighters, the freedom fighters. All this started in this time period of outstanding and everyday citizens to express their feelings, their wants, and also their opposition to what the English or the British were trying to do to this country in this time period.
Very good, thank you. This actually got started up in Massachusetts. And 1772 was when they first started putting these committees together. But they really took hold when this little bitty event happened up there in Boston Harbor. We all know, now that I said that, you know what I'm talking about.
Boston Tea Party.
They had a big tea party, yes indeed. And after that kicked in, then these things started spreading like wildfire through the colonies. And that's how all 13 of them got taken over by these committees. They basically ran the government, and they took the royal governors and chased them out. As we know here in Virginia, Lord Dunmore was chased out. And they changed the name from Dunmore County. But it was when he was chased out, partly because these committees were taking over, so he wasn't going to be able to do much of anything. Well, he was also elected to the House of Burgesses in 1774 and 1775. He was the chair of these two committees he was on, and then he served as a delegate to the first Virginia Convention. And now, before we get into the nuts and bolts about him being in the Revolutionary War, we'll ask Richard here to come up and tell you a few facts about Peter Muhlenberg.
Johann Peter Muhlenberg. On November 6, 1770, he married Anne Barbara Hannah Miller, with whom he had 6 children. Of 8 colonies in the colonels in the Virginia militia, Muhlenberg was the youngest at 29. Only Patrick Henry had less experience than him. On February 1st, 1777, Peter Muhlenberg was promoted to brigadier general. He learned much about the art of soldiering, and was reported that his men were very well disciplined. He saw service in the battles of Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth after the Battle of Monmouth. Another important factor in Muhlenberg's generalship was his good relationship with George Washington. Muhlenberg was a young officer, only 31 when he made brigadier general in the state of Virginia, but there were virtually no troops raised in the state. No, I don't know where that is. On September 30th, 1783, Congress promoted him to major general. In 1784, his German neighbors elected him as Montgomery County's representative to the Pennsylvania Supreme Executive Council. He was elected vice president of the council, a position comparable to that of lieutenant governor. Muhlenberg was an anti-federalist, was elected a Pennsylvania representative to the U.S. Congress, serving from 1789 to 1795, and again from 1799 to 1801. He managed Thomas McKean's campaign for governor and helped elect Thomas Jefferson as U.S. president. President Thomas Jefferson appointed him the supervisor of revenue for Pennsylvania in 1801 and customs collector for Philadelphia in 1802. He served in the latter post until his death. On October 1st, 1807, his 61st birthday, he died at Gray's Ferry, Pennsylvania. He is buried in Augustus Lutheran Church in Trapp, Pennsylvania.
Thank you. What a guy, huh? You know, he's almost a Renaissance man before they even had Renaissance men. Well, it wasn't quite early, right period, but he was a really remarkable individual, and you could tell he's what we would call a mover and shaker today. He knew people. He knew a lot of people that had a lot of power. In fact, George Washington is the one that asked him, said, I'd like you to go out and recruit a bunch of men and get this regiment. And so toward the end of 1775, when George asked him to do that, he said, I'd like you to become the commander. So they took it up to the Virginia Convention. And so in the early part of 76, they said, we're going to make you a colonel. So here's this guy, 29 years old. He's been a preacher. His only military experience was with the British Army there for a short period of time, and they're making him a colonel. Now, that tells you something right there. Of course, back in those days, you could buy your way into a rank. But he didn't have the money to buy his way into rank at that time. So he had to be highly regarded with what he did there. Now, his brother Frederick was also a minister. And he just really did not like the fact that Peter was going to go fight. And he complained all the way until the British burned his church down, and then he went and joined the military too. That's just a little interesting little tidbit there on the side there. That now, we got a little bit here we can tell you about. He was first sent to defend the coast. We're going to tell you about the sermon a little later on, because we're going to highlight that at the end there. The 8th Regiment, which he was given command, was first sent down to South Carolina and Georgia. He first saw combat 1776 during the British attack on Sullivan's Island. Charles Lee, the American commander, mentioned in his report that the Virginia troops were brave to the last degree. Lee further said, I know not which corps I have the greatest reason to be pleased, with Muhlenberg's Virginians or the North Carolina troops. They are both equally alert, zealous, and spirited. Pretty high praise. In 1777, they were to join Washington's main army near Philadelphia, and that's when he was promoted to brigadier general. Of course, we know what happened in the winter of 77. Some little cold time they had up there in a little place in Valley Forge. Mm-hmm. Even though he didn't spend a lot of time at Valley Forge, because he was sent home to get some affairs in orders, and he also ended up having to go raise more people for regiments and stuff. So it was in May of 1777 that he assumed command of his new brigade, and they had the reputation of being some of the best trained men in the Army. When the Army marched through Philadelphia, George Washington asked Peter Muhlenberg to take his unit and lead the way, because they wanted the most impressive unit he had first. So that tells you something right there. He was a leader of men. His men would follow him and do what he wanted. He saw service in the battles of Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. At the American defeat of Brandywine, Peter Muhlenberg demonstrated his greatest bravery and led his troops in their charges. I'm going to have Chip right now read a little statement that was made about Peter Muhlenberg after the Battle of Brandywine. And keep in mind, this was an American defeat, and only one unit really did a good job there.
This is a quote from Peter Muhlenberg.
No, it's not from him, it's about him.
About him? Okay. I saw a quotation mark, so sure. Never did a body of men perform their duty with more firmness and zeal than the American left. It is a truth which defies contradiction that it was the only part of the American army that had good fortune to effect the service allotted it that day. For they broke the enemy's right, drove them at the point of bayonet through their encampment into the village, and made a large number of prisoners.
I see, even though all the rest of the army was collapsing, when they said the American left, that's because they were on the left flank of the army. So they called them the American left. And of course, the British right was the one that was pushed back. And you remember what I said about the bayonet? They turned the tide on them, and they used the bayonet, and they went after them with the bayonet. And the bayonet was used many times by the Americans during the war after that time frame. And it wasn't just all because of him, but they used it a lot. And very effective. In fact, when they were down at Yorktown, when they took one of the redoubts, they did not take any ammunition with them. They went with bayonets only because they didn't want the enemy to hear them and stuff like that. So they took all the metal off them, put bayonets on the end, charged over the top of the hill, took it in about 10 minutes. Pretty impressive stuff. After the Battle of Monmouth, the focus was turned to the south. In 1780, he was reassigned to the defense of Virginia with mainly militia units. Now, this created a problem for him. As much as we hate to say it, those militia units from Virginia were not well-trained, disciplined people. Had a lot of trouble with them. But he managed to keep them somewhat in order. And because what they were trying to do, because they knew the British were moving to the southern campaign up in the north, it had become a stalemate. And so the British said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to go down to the south, and we will defeat them down in the south, then we'll march those people up to the south, and we'll catch them in a pincher movement between New York and these troops coming up there. Cornwallis's people were sent down there. We know what happened to him, and that'll be another story when we talk about it in October in the Siege of Yorktown. So anyway, they're going to send him down there, and his job was to keep them from taking over Virginia, because what the British are concentrating on right now is Georgia and South Carolina. So, what happens? The little guy that we all know his name was an American hero at one time, Benedict Arnold. One of the first things that he did after he turned over to the British was to get a group of people and come down to Virginia and start to head up. His job was to go to Richmond and capture Governor Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. Well, he got away, and we know about the story about that, but one of the things that Muhlenberg's men had to do was contain him. His job was to contain him and not let him run rapid through the countryside here in Virginia. So he kept them, was able to do that. He was able to get these troops that weren't well disciplined and get them disciplined enough to where he could kind of keep them down there. Now the problem was Muhlenberg's people were all light infantry. So he didn't have any cannon to go with him to support himself either. Of course, the British had cannons. Which that does make a bit of a difference. That bayonet may have been the most feared weapon, but nobody liked having a cannon shot at him and take out a whole bunch of people at one time. So his job was to keep that from happening. Well, they sent General von Steuben down to take Virginia. So Muhlenberg went to work for him, and he still had the militia underneath him. Next thing you know, Marquis de Lafayette reinforced Muhlenberg with plans to attack the British at Portsmouth. Well, the British were able, because what they thought was going to happen, they thought the French fleet was going to come down there and bring reinforcements to the Americans and the French down there at that time. The problem is that's one of the battles that the French lost out at the sea. So they didn't get there. So what reinforcements came? And you guessed it, the British. So all of a sudden, Lafayette and Muhlenberg did not have enough troops to go attack Portsmouth. All they could do was keep them from moving out of Portsmouth. Von Steuben wrote, General Muhlenberg merits my particular acknowledgments for the good disposition which he made and the great gallantry with which he executed it. So as the army and the campaign started moving forward, we know what happened at Kings Mountain when the British were totally destroyed there. We know what Cowpens. We discussed that before. When the elite unit in the British Army at the time, Cornwallis's best man, Tarleton, was defeated and totally destroyed his elite unit. So the British are on their heels. But they do get the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and a couple other battles, but they're not great victories for them. They're actually losing more men, and they're not able to replace them. And they don't have the supplies to maintain these troops. So they said, what you got to do? He's got to get over to a place where the British can get down and, reinforcing, and they pick Yorktown. Now, of course, the problem with the British getting reinforcements at Yorktown is that is the Battle of the Capes happened in the 3rd of September down there when the British fleet came down, met the French, and it's the only battle in the Revolutionary War there are no Americans involved in. The only major battle, the only major battle. No Americans were involved in the Battle of the Capes. And the French defeated the British for one of the few times on the high seas. So the British were locked in there. Well, here again, what was one of the first units that were to lead the troops in? Peter Muhlenberg's. They asked him to help lead the troops, and they bring them in around the right side. And they had these 2 redoubts down there that the Americans were trying to take, and they were redoubt 10 and 9, and then they had another redoubt. A redoubt is a small fort that they build on the outside of a fort, and they build it up so that you can't come in there and just charge up there. We don't see them this much anymore because the weaponry today is so advanced. So they got this redoubt, number 10, and that was the one there that the Americans took with bayonets only. But part of Muhlenberg's men were involved in that, even though Alexander Hamilton is the one that led the charge up into that there. Well, his Corps of Light Infantry, get this here, this is how big his unit was. 22 units from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and New Jersey. And they held down that right flank throughout the siege. And it was a siege. The difference between a siege and a battle usually takes, a couple hours, sometimes 30 minutes. The Battle of Cowpens was roughly an hour. A siege, it's where you slowly bring in and close it in on them. They would dig these trenches, move forward, put some cannons up there, fire them off there, put trenches forward some more, and just slowly move in and bring this and close it down in on them. Like, the pincers coming in on something like that. So that's why it was called a siege. On October 23rd, 4 days after the British surrender, Muhlenberg wrote to Washington to request leave from the Army on account of a constant and violent fever I have had for 10 days past, which he had said reduced me very much. As most of us know, we lost more men to disease and sickness in the Revolutionary War than we did to anything else. He did remain in Virginia to recruit and organize troops, and on September 30th, 1783, Congress promoted him to Major General, and the Army was disbanded that November because the Treaty of Paris had been signed. And now, Chip, you want to tell us a little bit about what he did after he left the Army?
Now, after the war, Muhlenberg did not feel he could return being a person after had been a soldier. Being a parson after being a soldier. In 1784, he surveyed the military bounty lands assigned to Virginia veterans, traveling as far as Louisville, but then he returned to his native Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Later in 1784, his German neighbors elected him as Montgomery County's representative to Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, the state's governing body under its first constitution. At the end of his 3-year term, Muhlenberg served as vice president of this body, the equivalent of a lieutenant governor. It was in this capacity that he became an ex officio member of the Board of Trustees of the University of State of Pennsylvania, now the University of Pennsylvania. Shortly thereafter, Muhlenberg, as an anti-federalist, was elected a Pennsylvania representative to the U.S. Congress, serving from 1789 to 1795, and again from 1799 to 1801. He was considered a key figure in the Democratic Republican Party of Pennsylvania, managing Thomas McKean's successful campaign for the governor and helping to elect Thomas Jefferson as U.S. President. In 1801, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, but before taking his seat, he resigned to accept the lucrative position of supervisor of the U.S. Customs in the Pennsylvania District. In 1803, he became a collector of customs in the port of Pennsylvania. He remained active as a Lutheran layman until his death in 1807 at his suburban home at Gray's Ferry on the Susquehanna River.
Thank you.
I pronounced that right.
You came close enough. Now we'll talk a little bit about the sermon. Because there's a lot of questions going on about what the sermon was. When he was told that they wanted him to become the commander of this regiment, word got out to the people because as he come back, you know, he was out trying to recruit people. And he had to put 10 companies together. So we're going to read you a little bit about the different things. Henry Muhlenberg, who was a descendant of Peter Muhlenberg, 75 years after the fact, wrote, General Muhlenberg was a minister of a parish in Virginia, but participating in the spirit of times, exchanged his clerical profession for that of a soldier. Having in his pulpit inculcated the principles of liberty and the cause of his country, he found no difficulty in enlisting a regiment of soldiers, and he was appointed their commander. He entered his pulpit with his sword and cockade, preached his farewell sermon, and the next day marched at the head of his regiment to join the army. And he does honor to the military profession. Now, there's a guy, James Thatcher, who was an officer in the Revolutionary Army. He wrote a little different thing. He acknowledged that Muhlenberg fiercely defended the American cause. He offers no specifics as to what Muhlenberg actually said, but he did say that he wanted those people to join him, that Muhlenberg marched to join the army the day after his farewell sermon. The difference we're looking at here, Henry Muhlenberg said this happened on 21 January. Well, there's been a lot of research done since that. There was a book written by John Wayland back in the 1800s about the history of Shenandoah County and that, and it says that he preached his sermon in January. Well, we've got to dispute that for a couple of things here. For one thing, he said he preached it 21 January, went up there, pulled off his sword and said, now is a time to fight. You know, said there's been a time for prayer and peace and talking and stuff, but no, it's the time to fight right now. And he rips it off and he's dressed like this here. Of course, he probably didn't have a hat on because he was preaching, so I'll take mine off. And goes outside and all these guys are kissing their wives and their children and they're all signing up. And he signs up 300 people and marches off to war. Well, we can dispute that a couple of reasons. For one thing, down there at that time, there were not 300 military men living there in Woodstock or in that part of Shenandoah County that he would have gone for. And he had to put 10 companies together. 2 companies came out of his region down there. Actually, 2 companies came from up here, between what we now have here and up in Frederick County. There were some companies come out of here, so some of our people here, and I haven't found for sure exactly which ones, but I'm researching that as to which people from our area here actually served with Muhlenberg. So he had to get these 10 companies and he had to go around and get them. And it's more than likely, and Mike Cicere, who is a historian and an author, did a lot of research, and he had found that it probably happened in March. And the reason we can look at that and say that, we probably think it was Sunday, March 17th, because he left Woodstock March the 21st. He was in Williamsburg on April 3rd to receive his colonel's commission from the Virginia Committee of Safety. The probability that Muhlenberg's farewell sermon occurred in March is supported by the fact that Backford Parish Register records that Peter continued to baptize and marry parishioners up until his departure in March. So, it's more than likely his last sermon was in March, not in January, but we'll celebrate January because that's what everybody's doing right now. But the thing is, he did do that. He did have a final sermon. He did go up there and tell them, you know, now's the time to fight. And I can get back here, I think I've got the exact language put there. You got that exact language put there right there with you?
Yeah.
If Bedford Parish has its registered, it will be.
You want to read his exact words?
I
I got them here, but if you want to, go for it. Go ahead.
according to the legend, right, of the 21st.
Right.
Okay.
I think you probably said whether it was the 21st or the...
Yeah. So supposedly, okay, I'm not sure, like Dale said, I was prepared to, just in case he called on me, that Peter Muhlenberg preached on one famous sermon that we read about, and the sermon came from Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8, that I'm going to read first before I quote supposedly what Muhlenberg said. Just to read the Ecclesiastics 3, 1 through 8. See if I can see with these glasses on, because I did not print smaller than him. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. And a time of war, and a time of peace. Then, as he quoted from his famous sermon, in the language of the Holy Writ, there is a time for all things. There is a time to preach and a time to fight. And now it is time to fight.
You know, even just listening to the words from Ecclesiastes there, it's pretty powerful how he would speak to the people and how they would follow him. And when you take somebody that's a dynamic speaker and you get them some words like that, you can see why people were moved to join him. And he was definitely an incredible leader there. And I'll just give you a little tidbit of information too about the muskets here. You saw me take the musket from him to make it easier for him to do that. We don't let anybody handle these muskets unless we certify you. Now I'm certified, in fact I'm one of the certifiers. These guys are all certified. So we can hand each other the muskets. But we can't hand them to you. Now we can let you touch it and hold it, but we got to keep a hold of it and control of it. So as long as we got a hold of like the strap here, you can kind of hold it. So just a little side thing, if you come up after and you want to talk to them about touching the weapons there,
Yeah, heavy it is.
we can't let people take control of it. Well, anyway, Peter Muhlenberg was an able officer both on and off the battlefield and a valuable asset to the American High Command. He performed well, whether he was training troops, dispelling mutinies, leading soldiers under fire, or relating with fellow officers. In combat, he was brave, daring, and ambitious, looking for any weakness of the enemy to exploit. In camp, he oversaw the training for his men that made them some of the best disciplined in the service. He did not achieve such good results when he led the militia, but he did his best with the limited supplies and time available. As a young officer, he recognized what he did not know, joyfully submitted to Washington's decisions, and developed a close relationship with him. He worked well with other officers and formed many lasting friendships. Muhlenberg was of great service to the American cause and achieved some manner of fame in his own day. However, few Americans today know of this great soldier. He has been largely neglected by historians. No biography has been written for him for over 75 years. He is hardly mentioned even in books on the battles in which he fought. He was a steady, faithful officer, but he never had the chance at a glorious feat of arms to go down to posterity. As one historian wrote, outside of his home state, he's not well known. But Muhlenberg was one of the many steady, unsung heroes of the war. He was one of a legion of firm, steady commanders who were indispensable in winning the fight for American independence. After the war, he surveyed military bounty lands assigned to Virginia veterans, traveling as far as Louisville. But eventually, he returned to his native Montgomery County in Pennsylvania. John Peter Muhlenberg was an American clergyman, Continental Army soldier, and political figure in the newly independent United States. A Lutheran minister, he served in the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate from Pennsylvania. He was a true patriot and a great American. Thank you.
Dale,
Sir.
isn't there a school?
He was also an Anglican clergyman.
Yes. Yes.
Have to be.
He was ordained as an Anglican man, even though he,
Yeah.
yeah.
Isn't there a school in Shenandoah County named Peter Muhlenberg School?
Yes,
Elementary or middle school?
yeah, yeah.
And there's also a Muhlenberg Motors. Would that be family related?
It's named for him. His family did not stay here.
Okay.
They all went up to Pennsylvania, and up in Pennsylvania, there's a couple of schools and streets named for him.
Okay.
But
I
yeah,
knew there was one in Shenandoah
Yeah.
County and there was a Muhlenberg Motors. in
yeah,
Shenandoah.
he's very little was written about him because he didn't have like see Morgan could lay his claim to a couple things, well, a number of things. But Morgan was the kind of guy, he was up in your face. He would go out and make headlines because he was just that kind. Morgan was actually, when he was a young man, he was a bully. He was known as the toughest guy up there in that section of town when he was in there, and he could beat up anybody that came around, and that's how he did discipline a lot in the Army. You didn't follow his orders, he took you out back and whooped you. He was one tough hombre. He got shot. Round went through his jaw there, took most of his jaw away. You don't see it in pictures because he wouldn't let anybody paint that, and most of the time you see his face turned a little bit. He didn't want to see that, but he had that dressing, but he survived that, got shot in the head. He received 500 lashes. But what the story is, he said he counted them, and the British owed him one because they only gave him 499. Most people getting lashed with 500 lashes did not survive. He survived it. Everything they threw at him, he survived. And he was the kind of guy who made headlines. When he was up at Quebec, the Battle of Quebec, his was the only unit that got in there. And when he was up there and they're asking him to surrender, when he took his sword off, he would not give it to a British officer because he did not want to surrender to another officer. He gave it to a clergyman. And that way he could say he never surrendered to a British officer. So he was always making headlines. What did Muhlenberg do? Well, he went down here and preached for 4 years, went in the Army, and did everything they asked him when they asked him. He was a great trainer of men and a great leader of men. But those guys, they work proactively. They don't get the headlines that a guy that's reactive gets. Now, when you wanted to have something done, like they would send Morgan's riflemen out to do something, they were doing that because they were reacting to something, and they were going in the front there. But Muhlenberg, he just was steady, solid, and he was always winning. Now, he did lose some battles, but like I said, even there in Brandywine, he went up and won that. See, but Brandywine is not a well-known battle. And you talk about Valley Forge, he was only there for a short time. He didn't spend the whole winter there like some of the other guys did. But most of the time when you hear about Valley Forge, what you're hearing about is two people, Washington and von Steuben, even though there were a couple thousand people up there. But that's who you always hear about because of their impact on it. So even though Muhlenberg was there a little bit. You know, when you go down to Yorktown, he helped hold down that right side there, but what are you going to hear about when you talk Yorktown? Well, on the American side, of course, you're going to hear about Washington, you're going to hear about Lafayette, you hear about the Cross, you know, you hear about Hamilton, you hear about these people that have got notoriety. Muhlenberg, he just crawled right back into his shell, went back, did his job. And that part, I think, what made him such a great man and a great leader of men, is that he didn't ask his men to do anything they didn't think that he would do. And he would go right up front with them, and he would get right out in the front of the battle, unlike some of the generals that turned tail and ran. But that's a story for another day. So with that, if you got more questions, fine, come and talk to us. I think we're going to have a little bit of cookies and stuff out here. Yes, ma'am?
Who would you fight for, Morgan or Muhlenberg?
Who would I?
Who would you rather fight with?
I would have rather have gone with Morgan.
Morgan? Yeah, I could see you doing that.
He's
Because you want to bust him in the
you know,
chops.
yeah, but also, you know, he with his riflemen and being out there in the front, that was more me, just, you know, to do that. I would have preferred to have been in one of those type units. Yeah.
I think, well, he was fluent in both German
He
and
was.
English, and I think that made him a valuable asset to the group around Washington, because he could, and many of the people that lived in the valley were of German background.
Well, you're absolutely correct about that.
So, so
the-
that made him probably, you know,
Oh, he was.
very useful
It is.
in other ways than in a battle.
That is one of the reasons why they wanted him to lead that, because he was fluent in both languages. And not only that, even though he was German and got along well with the Germans, he got along well with the Scots-Irish that were down there in Woodstock.
He
And part of his unit, maybe a third to a half of it would have been Scotch-Irish, but I know at least half, if not more, were Germans. And they had moved down here in that great habitation that came down here to start with there. So yes, you're absolutely correct about that, Milton. he was extremely valuable because he was bilingual and very fluent in them both. And since he had actually been over in Europe and seen how they fought over there, lived with the German people over there, he knew how they thought and lived over there. And of course over here he had lived with them and knew how they lived in here. So yeah, he knew how to get along with people. I guess we would call that tactful and diplomatic today.
Yeah, and
And he turned out to be a good politician too, so that was proven.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely correct. Well, yeah, I mean, anyway, you can come up and talk to us all you want. We'll be here a little bit because I know we're gonna probably eat some cookies. We went to dinner and didn't have dessert, so we could have a cookie when we got here.
Yeah. They look good.
One interesting note, I know there's a lot of Civil War goes on here, but if you look at this real close, this design survived clear up until the Civil War. The Confederacy used a smooth bore, and if I remember correct, it was the 1863. If you look real close at this, not a whole lot of difference other than the way the lock stamped and maybe some of the configuration down here. But this design actually survived up until the Civil War. So just an interesting side note. That
A flintlock was used for probably almost 200 years.
Yeah,
People were using the flintlock.
some of them had to use the granddaddy's rifle.
Yeah, right.
They used what they had.
In the Civil War, some of Jackson's men got leftover flintlocks.
Yes,
Yeah.
And this
that's what he's
may-
talking about, that these weapons were used for 200 years.
No, but in the Civil War, didn't they use
They
different,
were
they didn't have balls
outdated.
anymore, they had the bullet shape?
Depending on what they were
No.
firing.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
If
If you
it was
used
rifle,
granddaddy's musket,
They would
like
have
Suzanne was saying, well, then you use the ball. You
Just
didn't
use
use-
the
yeah,
ball.
yeah, use the ball.
But if the newer rifles, and that,
And the buck and ball,
yes,
they had that then.
yeah. So,
well, many of them, I don't know about muskets, but many of the flintlocks were eventually converted to cap.
well, but flintlocks were either muskets or rifles. It's kind of a generic term.
Smoothbore.
It's about the firing mechanism down here.
Yeah,
This is what's called a flintlock, and whether you've got a smoothbore or a rifle, whatever weapon, this is what you know it's being a flintlock.
But
And
I'm-
yes, they were converted to cap and ball. Yeah, some of them. You're absolutely correct about that. Yes. Now we have this little cover that we put on here, the frizzen cover we call it, and this is a safety thing for us. They did not have those during the war. But, you know, that stops it from accidentally sparking on there, and we do have some idiots in the SAR, or in the
Not in
country
our
in
chapter.
general. Yeah, not our chapter.
Not in our color guard either.
Yeah. These things here, and you'll see if they get to start talking about them there, because, you know, our Muhlenberg part is over, but, you know, when you've got this thing here, and you push that up there, you got this little, see, I wasn't aiming at you, I was past you. I'm big on safety,
Everybody's
that's why,
like
Safety
backing
man's
up.
watching you.
you know. They got this little pan here, and you put your little powder in there, and then you flip this back over, that's what that does that. And this has got two cocking positions. And when you bring it all the way back, now it will fire. But if this is on here, it won't accidentally go off. So right before we fire, that's when we have the guys take that off and bring it to full cock.
So don't go half cock.
No, well, that's where the saying came from. Don't go
Yeah.
off half cock. A flash in the pan, that came from this here. Because sometimes when you fire it off, the pan would fire up, but the hole would be blocked. So you get this flash in the pan. And
And that's where this came into part, was actually a prick and a brush to clean that pan and
Clean
poke
that-
that hole open.
Yep. But, so this thing, it was a little more complex, a little harder to keep maintained till they went to the cap and ball. Which in that, of course, then they went beyond that there. But yeah, these things were used for a long time. And these flints, these things are really sharp. It doesn't take much, you go like that, just like getting a paper cut, only I think it hurts worse because,
Razor blade.
yeah, it is, just like a razor blade on there. So anyway, like I said, we're ready for our cookies and stuff, Melanie.
We do, we have
Thank you.